Okay, great. So now that you have your transcript or summary, your notes in here introduced, you want to code your data. And what is coding? Coding is simply defining what the data you're analyzing is about. It's akin to creating a tag or a folder. And so as you read through your notes, you go coding step by step. So the first one is librarian role and background. And Adrian says he's an e-resources librarian, oversees discovery service, e-journals, handles questions ranging from what should we acquire next to why isn't this ebook link working, takes a turn at the reference desk and helps students and faculty. Two common types of requests from students: I don't know how to use library, professor told me to use databases, but they don't even know what those are. Stuck when doing research because the topic is too general. And so as you can see, because our notes were pretty much verbatim, we have a lot of detail on librarian role and background. So this is where you have to exercise judgment on how much you want to code. So for example, for this project, it was the visual search project, and really the emphasis was on the knowledge graph and trying to understand users' perceptions of it, what they liked and disliked about it, etc. The pain points that researchers face, such as don't know how to use the library, don't know topic being too general, those pain points, that wasn't the focus of this study. We've conducted other studies just on these kinds of questions. And so with creating codes, you have to have the end goal in mind. And so if the goal when I'm reporting these results for knowledge graph will be to simply say, when it comes to role, to just say there was one e-resources librarian and two reference librarians and things like that, then really the only piece of information that's critical for me at this point is the title. And so I'll create a code. I'm sorry, I rushed through that. You add that and you say role is your code. So submit, and then I would highlight e-resources librarian and I would code it here. And you code by double clicking the code you created. Another way to code is to press the space bar on your computer and then the codes come up, and then you select this by double clicking it. Alternatively, once you've clicked the space bar and this has opened, you can just press once and click and press enter, and that codes it. So different ways to code. I like to use the quick code function by pressing my space bar and coding, simply because when the codes get really long, it's kind of tricky to go looking for the specific code you want, whereas with this way you can just start typing in the code and it pops up and then you can select it. But you can play with it and decide which method you like best. Okay, and so that's one parent code. The next question was, so the explore linked topics button. So for the knowledge graph, there was an explore linked topics button somewhere to the right, and we asked people what they expected that to do if they clicked it. And this one says list of synonyms expected, thinks it must be synonyms, etc. And so we want to create a code about expectations of explore linked buttons. And I should say right now, I might have typos as I go, just because I'm going quickly just to demonstrate to you how this works. So apologies in advance. So then we have expectations, and this one expects synonyms. Okay, so we create a child code or a subheading. You can think of it as a subheading where these are they're called parent codes in qualitative analysis, but you can think of them as heading 1 or the headings, and then your child codes come under them like subheadings. And we're creating a subheading now about synonyms, so that later on, if someone else says they expected synonyms, we would code it in this same code. And now we are kind of getting some quantitative data. So now you can start to see how the quantitative data would come in. So we've created that child code on synonyms, and we just say, all right. Okay, and we double clicked that to code it. So let me just say what I'm doing right now is what we call open coding in qualitative analysis. I'm reading through my data, creating preliminary labels for chunks of data or excerpts, and these chunks of data convey a meaningful idea. And so the excerpts I'm taking, what I'm highlighting, I'm trying to keep those comprehensive enough to capture the idea well, but not including information that's unnecessary. This is because after finishing your coding process, you'll be able to click into each of these codes using this kind of quotation button, and that will open up, and you'll see all of your excerpts listed under the expectations of the explore linked buttons. And so if you made your excerpts so lengthy to include unnecessary information, it won't be scannable and it won't be very easy for you to quickly glean what the expectations were for the explore linked buttons. But if you also make it so short, you'll be reading your own excerpts and not quite understanding what the context was. What does this mean? And so it's really a creative exercise, and you have to exercise some judgment. Okay, and so we'll just do one more here. So Adrian says, when I get to results, my initial reaction is to start digging in. I wouldn't expect to use it, that is the knowledge graph, until after determining initial results weren't as useful as hoped. It's interesting, but why do I need this? I need to see my first set of results and then see if I need something else. Okay, and so here it's kind of like the value of the knowledge graph is not immediately apparent, and so you want to just add in initial reactions to knowledge graph as your heading or your parent code. And one initial reaction is, say, value not immediately apparent. Submit. And you want to take that and code it under that. So notice that I'm coding these under the where they're supposed to go. I'm not coding it in initial reactions and in value not immediately apparent. Again, think of it as your folders or subfolders, and now you've created this folder of value not immediately apparent, and so of course you want to put the relevant information into that folder as opposed to, say, the parent folder. So that's just one thing. And another thing too is you can code one excerpt into multiple codes. And so typically for every study I do, well, most studies, I have a code for great quotes. Great quotes. Submit. And what I do is I add in whatever I might maybe put into a report or a PowerPoint presentation. And so if this was one of the great quotes, in addition to coding it as value not immediately apparent, I'd also want to code it under great quotes by double clicking that. And so now you see this excerpt has two codes. And that's another beauty of using software, because this is not something you can do with Excel. So later on, when I open up my great quotes, I'll find this as one of them. And when I open up my code on the value not immediately apparent, I'll also see this excerpt. So that's one advantage. Another thing I'd like to mention is when you're creating your codes, please make sure that the code effectively, adequately captures what you're trying to communicate. And so don't make it something that only you would understand, especially if you're working collaboratively on a project. Your teammates should be able to see it and understand it, so that if I was working on this project with Alyssa, she could also be coding, and she's coding another interview, not by Adrian, but she was assigned somebody else. Let's say this is somebody else like Katie, and she wanted to code their role or responsibility. Yeah, I'm trying to get to ones just so I can demonstrate how that would go. in any case, let's assume this was role, this was some things about role, and this was another person's interview. She would just highlight that there were the reference librarian and code it there. Because if you work collaboratively, you still use the same coding structure. So you don't make your own coding structure. You won't, for instance, create a code saying Alisa's codes and then create your own codes. No, you will just use the existing structure and you can keep building on that. And so if Alisa was working with me and I'd already created these codes, it doesn't mean that she's stuck to these codes. She can still create other codes. So later on, there is the reaction to prototype. And this is Alisa now creating a new code that then I will see when I open up this project, and when I'm coding reactions to the prototype, I will include it in this code. So that's how you can do it. And how do you delete codes? You just go to this gear here and we delete. You say yes. A note on deleting codes, this is a step that you can't undo. There's no Control Z. So please be very careful about deleting codes, because if you had coded this entire, all these summaries, and now you have all this information about the value, the initial reactions to knowledge graph, and then you delete it, well, guess what? You'll have to code the entire document again. I mean, not the entire document, but that section talking about the reactions to the knowledge graph, and then redo that. So be very careful about deleting codes or about merging codes. So later on, you could decide that actually these two codes, I want them to be one. And again, you'll go to your gear and you'll merge the codes and you'll say what your primary code ought to be, and then what the secondary code is. And so really what's happening here is this second code will be merged into that first code. And that step 2 is irreversible. So deleting, merging, be very careful about that. So my recommendation is, aside from making your codes very clear and understandable and paying attention to deleting and merging, I would advise you to just overcode than undercode. And what I mean by that is, if you're going through an interview document like this, and you're making your codes, it's better to have two codes. One saying researchers struggle to find the right database, and then researchers struggle to narrow down their topic. And so these are information literacy challenges. But rather than creating a code called information literacy and throwing everything in there, it's much better to have them be the separate points about struggling to find the database and struggling to narrow down a topic, because then you can find out how many people struggle with this specific thing versus that specific thing. Whereas if you lumped them all up into a higher level concept or a theme, now all you can say is 6 participants had information literacy challenges, but you can't communicate what kinds of information literacy challenges, how many have this and that. And so that's just another guideline. So that's how you code. So in the next part, I will show you some examples from projects that we've completed as a UX team. And so thank you very much.